The year 1875 stretched its skeletal fingers across Scotland, a land steeped in ancient lore and weathered by the unforgiving hand of nature. It was an era of stark contrasts, of burgeoning industrial might in the lowlands, yet enduring, grinding poverty in the remote highland glens. The wind, a constant mournful companion, scoured the treeless moors, whistling through the skeletal remains of forgotten crofts, and carrying with it the scent of damp earth, peat smoke, and the pervasive tang of the sea. Superstition, a tenacious weed, flourished in these isolated communities, entwining itself with daily life, providing a dark, often comforting explanation for the inexplicable in a world ruled by harsh realities. Famine, a recurring specter, had recently tightened its grip, leaving in its wake a cruel harvest of human suffering and, all too often, abandoned children. It was out of this grim necessity that the Black Hollow Orphanage came into being, not as a beacon of philanthropic vision, but as a pragmatic, if stark solution to a mounting crisis. Philanthropy in the Victorian age often wore a stern face, dictated by a rigid moral code that viewed poverty as a moral failing as much as a societal ill. Orphans, particularly those whose parents had succumbed to disease, destitution, or desperation, were seen as souls to be rescued from the gutter and molded into disciplined, God-fearing citizens, capable of contributing to the burgeoning British Empire. Their early lives, often marked by deprivation and loss, were to be replaced by a regimen of hard work, strict religious instruction, and unwavering obedience. Black Hollow itself was strategically, if chillingly placed, deep within a secluded valley known locally as Corrie and Fithich, the Raven's Corrie. It sat miles from the nearest village, Gyarnshiel. The track leading to it was little more than a muddy scar across the moorland, often swallowed by mist or rendered impassable by winter snows. The orphanage building was a formidable 3-story edifice, constructed of the same dark, unforgiving granite that dominated the landscape. Its architecture spoke not of welcome, but of enclosure. Its narrow, deep-set windows gazing out like cold, unblinking eyes over a desolate vista of heather and rock. It was a place designed to keep the world out and the children firmly in. For the young souls consigned to its care, Black Hollow was a world apart. These were children who had known hunger, fear, and the profound, isolating ache of loss. They arrived clutching scant possessions, their small faces often grimed with the dust of long journeys or streaked with the residue of unshed tears. Within its thick, unyielding walls, they found a stark, unwavering routine. Cold halls, meager rations, and the constant scrutinizing gaze of stern caretakers. Here, the raw edges of their grief were to be sanded down, their individual spirits subsumed into the collective, regimented life of the institution. Yet, even in these early days, before the true depths of Black Hollow's strangeness began to manifest, a subtle disquiet began to permeate the remote glen. The few shepherds who grazed their flocks within sight of its formidable walls spoke of an unnatural stillness that hung perpetually around the orphanage. The usual sounds of childhood, the boisterous shouts, the playful squabbles, the fleeting moments of joyous release, were conspicuously absent. Instead, a pervasive, almost palpable quiet seemed to radiate from the stone building, a silence that felt less like peace and more like a profound, unnatural emptiness. It was the first, faint whisper in the wind, hinting that within those austere walls, something was not merely different, but profoundly, chillingly wrong. Life within the stone embrace of Black Hollow Orphanage was a testament to the harsh utilitarianism of the Victorian era. Days unfolded with a monotonous, relentless rhythm, each hour meticulously structured, every activity designed to foster discipline and subdue individuality. The pervasive cold was an unspoken constant, seeping from the granite walls into the very bones of its young residents. The common rooms, cavernous and sparsely furnished, offered little comfort against the biting Scottish chill. Meals were a quiet, hurried affair. Thin gruel, often watery broth, and dense, unyielding bread were served on rough-hewn tables, devoured quickly by small, hungry hands. The staff, primarily comprised of a stern matron, Mrs. Galbraith, and a handful of equally unyielding assistant caretakers, enforced a rigid code of conduct. Voices were to be kept low, movements economical, and personal expressions of emotion, particularly grief or anger, were strictly forbidden. The children were expected to be seen and not heard, to work diligently at their chores, and to absorb the endless lessons in scripture and moral rectitude that dominated their limited education. There were no toys, no games, no allowances for the natural exuberance of youth. Childhood, in Black Hollow, was a brief, utilitarian prelude to a life of hard labor or domestic service, and any deviation from this path was met with swift, unyielding correction. Yet, what struck even the most hardened villagers, those few who occasionally made the arduous journey to the orphanage for supply deliveries or to collect a child for apprenticeship, was not merely the strictness, but the pervasive, unnerving quietness of the children themselves. They rarely spoke, even amongst themselves. Their movements were often slow, deliberate, almost synchronized, as if guided by an unseen hand. Laughter was an alien sound within the orphanage walls, and tears were rarer still. Instead, they moved through their days in a state of unsettling passivity, their gazes often vacant, their small faces devoid of the vivid emotions one would expect from a cohort of young souls. Alistair Campbell, a grizzled old farmer who delivered sacks of potatoes and flour twice a month, would recount his visits with a shiver, even years later. He spoke of the children lining up to receive their rations, their eyes following him with a disconcerting stillness. "No chatter, ye understand," he'd murmur. "Not like normal bairns. Just watching, like we stone statues, only breathing." His wife, Isabel, who sometimes accompanied him, described a profound sense of emptiness she felt in their presence. It was as if their voices had been plucked right out of them, she once told a neighbor, leaving naught but hollow spaces behind. Even the matron, Mrs. Galbraith, a woman renowned for her iron will and emotional detachment, made a passing comment in a letter to the orphanage board, preserved in the dusty archives of the Highland Presbytery. She noted, almost as an aside, "The children, though numerous, are remarkably compliant. A quiet collection. Little need for firm discipline, as they seem to absorb instruction with a peculiar, uncomplaining stillness." It was a casual observation, penned without alarm, yet in retrospect, it became a chilling testament to the early signs of a profound, unsettling anomaly. The silence of the Black Hollow orphans was not merely the result of stern discipline. It was something deeper, something innate, a pervasive quietness that seemed to emanate from their very being, a stillness that would soon give way to far more sinister manifestations. The unsettling quiet of Black Hollow Orphanage was, for a time, simply dismissed as the predictable outcome of strict Victorian discipline. Locals, hardened by their own struggles, saw little cause for concern in children who were seen and not heard. Yet, as the calendar pages turned, and the mists grew thicker over Corrie and Fithich, the whispers began to shift, to deepen, to take on a more ominous tone. The silence within the orphanage seemed to breed something else entirely, a subtle, insidious disquiet that seeped beyond its granite walls and into the troubled minds of those who lived within earshot. It began with sounds, not the sounds of boisterous children, but something altogether more eerie. Shepherds, out late on the moors tending to lambing ewes or tracking straying sheep, reported hearing strange melodies carried on the wind. It was not the familiar melancholy strains of a Gaelic lament, nor the boisterous tunes of a tseli. It was, rather, a low, repetitive humming, sometimes a breathy, wordless chant, a sound both mournful and profoundly unsettling. Old Hamish, a man whose family had grazed sheep in the glen for generations, swore he once heard what sounded like a chorus of small, breathy voices, singing a tune he couldn't place, devoid of all joy, drifting from the orphanage on a moonless night. He dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps too much whiskey, but the sound, he admitted, had raised the hairs on his arms. Then came the more direct, personal accounts from those who had cause to venture inside. Morag, a young woman from Guernsey hired for a few weeks to assist with laundry, left Black Hollow abruptly, her face pale and drawn. She refused to speak of what she had witnessed, only muttering about the children's eyes. "They're empty," she whispered to her mother, her voice barely audible. "Like they're looking through you, not at you. And sometimes they don't blink. Not for a long, long time." She swore that some of the younger ones would stand perfectly still for minutes on end, staring into space, as if waiting for an unheard command. Her family believed she had simply found the work too hard, the orphanage too grim, but the fear in her eyes was too visceral, too profound to be easily dismissed. The unsettling quiet of Black Hollow Orphanage was, for a time, simply dismissed as the predictable outcome of strict Victorian discipline. Locals, hardened by their own struggles, saw little cause for concern in children who were seen and not heard. Yet, as the calendar pages turned, and the mists grew thicker over Corrie and Fithich, the whispers began to shift, to deepen, to take on a more ominous tone. The silence within the orphanage seemed to breed something else entirely. A subtle, insidious disquiet that seeped beyond its granite walls and into the troubled minds of those who lived within earshot. It began with sounds, not the sounds of boisterous children, but something altogether more eerie. Shepherds, out late on the moors tending to lambing ewes or tracking straying sheep, reported hearing strange melodies carried on the wind. It was not the familiar melancholy strains of a Gaelic lament, nor the boisterous tunes of a tseli. It was, rather, a low, repetitive humming, sometimes a breathy, wordless chant, a sound both mournful and profoundly unsettling. Old Hamish, a man whose family had grazed sheep in the glen for generations, swore he once heard what sounded like a chorus of small, breathy voices, singing a tune he couldn't place, devoid of all joy, drifting from the orphanage on a moonless night. He dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps too much whiskey, but the sound, he admitted, had raised the hairs on his arms. Then came the more direct, personal accounts from those who had cause to venture inside. Morag, a young woman from Guernsey hired for a few weeks to assist with laundry, left Black Hollow abruptly, her face pale and drawn. She refused to speak of what she had witnessed, only muttering about the children's eyes. "They're empty," she whispered to her mother, her voice barely audible. "Like they're looking through you, not at you. And sometimes they don't blink. Not for a long, long time." She swore that some of the younger ones would stand perfectly still for minutes on end, staring into space, as if waiting for an unheard command. Her family believed she had simply found the work too hard, the orphanage too grim, but the fear in her eyes was too visceral, too profound to be easily dismissed. More disturbing still were the small, inexplicable disappearances, not of entire children at first, but of their brief, almost ethereal presences. A caretaker, Sister Mary, an elderly woman with failing eyesight, reported misplacing children during chores. "I turn my back to fetch a bucket," she'd mutter. "And young Agnes, she's gone from her scrubbing. I look for her, calling out softly, but she's not there. And then, as if by magic, she's back, standing right where she was, silent as a mouse, never says where she's been." These were dismissed as the fumbling errors of an old woman, or perhaps a child's mischievous game, but the frequency and the seamlessness of these brief vanishings began to raise an internal alarm, even amongst the detached staff. The children themselves, those quiet, unsettling inhabitants, began to exhibit new, disturbing behaviors. They would gather in small clusters, their heads bowed, whispering in a language that sounded almost like static to the adult ear, a low, continuous murmur that defied comprehension. They would stare intently at blank walls, their gazes fixed on some unseen point, as if watching a silent play unfold. The pervasive quiet that had once been merely unnerving now felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken meaning, filled with the echoes of unseen things. The first signs were subtle, easily dismissed by the rational mind, but they were there, weaving a tapestry of dread that was slowly but surely beginning to unravel the ordinary fabric of life in Black Hollow. As the unsettling occurrences at Black Hollow Orphanage escalated, so too did the tide of rumor and speculation that washed over the isolated glen. The official lines of communication, stretching from the orphanage to the distant parish council and the church board in Edinburgh, remained largely unmoved. These august bodies concerned more with budgets and protocol and with the spectral quality of children's gazes, attributed any disquiet to the inherent difficulties of managing large numbers of destitute youth in a remote location. Yet, in the kitchens of Gairnshiel and around the smoky hearths of lonely crofts, a different narrative began to take shape, one woven from fragmented eyewitness accounts and the deeply ingrained threads of Scottish folklore. Father Malcolm, the parish priest from Gairnshiel, a man of stern faith and pragmatic disposition, was initially dismissive of the growing whispers. He attributed the tales of strange singing and hollow-eyed children to the overactive imaginations of superstitious villagers. But a visit to Black Hollow in the spring of 1876 began to chip away at his certainty. He had arrived to deliver catechism lessons, his usual booming voice prepared to cut through any youthful recalcitrance. Instead, he was met by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The children sat before him, perfectly still, their eyes fixed not on his face, but on some point just beyond his shoulder. Their responses to his questions were monotone, almost whispered, as if speaking required immense effort. It was like preaching to a wall of pale, unblinking dolls. He later confided to a trusted colleague, a tremor in his voice. Souls they may have, but their spirits seemed distant, elsewhere. Dr. Alara Reed, a forward-thinking physician from Inverness, had visited the orphanage around the same period, dispatched to assess reports of persistent malaise among the children. She noted cases of malnutrition, unsurprising given the meager diet, but also documented a peculiar lethargy that defied simple explanation. More chillingly, she observed the phenomenon of the children's empty eyes firsthand. She described a group of girls standing in the yard, staring collectively at a patch of barren earth, their faces utterly devoid of expression. When she knelt to speak to one, the child slowly turned her head, her gaze passing through Dr. Reed as if she were a pane of glass. These testimonies, however rationalized by the individuals themselves, fueled the darker imaginings of the community. Scotland, after all, was a land whose very soil was steeped in ancient belief. Tales of the Seath, the Fey folk, lingered in the shadowed glens, beings who were said to steal human children, leaving changelings in their place, or to lure mortals into their invisible realms from which they never returned. The concept of thin places, where the veil between worlds grew permeable, was not merely a romantic notion, but a deeply held conviction. Villagers spoke of the hungry earth, of ancient pagan rites performed on these moors long before the coming of Christianity, of stones that held echoes of primal forces. Old Man MacLeod, the oldest resident of Gairnshiel, a man whose memory stretched back to the Napoleonic Wars, would nod sagely when the orphanage was mentioned. Black Hollow, he'd wheeze, his eyes distant. Always been a place of hungry ground. The old ones they knew built their fires elsewhere. The orphans, they're too close to the edge, too close to where the world dips. He spoke of an ancient standing stone, long since pulled down for building material, that had once stood precisely where the orphanage's main dormitory now lay. This stone, he claimed, had been a focal point for rituals performed in the deepest winter, rites meant to appease or bargain with entities that dwelt beneath the earth. The orphanage, once a symbol of desperate charity, was rapidly transforming in the collective consciousness of the locals. It was no longer merely a grim institution, but a place infused with dread, a nexus of strange occurrences and ancient terrifying lore. The rumors coalesced into a chilling narrative. Black Hollow was not just an orphanage. It was a hungry place. A place where the living touched the edges of something unseen, and where a silence of children was no longer merely unnerving, but a profound, terrifying sign. The escalating reports, though often dismissed as rural superstition by distant authorities, eventually necessitated more formal inquiries into Black Hollow Orphanage. The local gentry, ever concerned with maintaining order and the appearance of proper governance, dispatched their representatives. These were not seasoned detectives, but rather men of standing, a justice of the peace, a reverend from a larger parish, and occasionally, a medical inspector. Their visits, however, far from resolving the mounting mystery, only seemed to deepen it, adding new layers of chilling questions to an already unsettling narrative. The Justice of the Peace, Mr. Ewan McGregor, arrived in the autumn of 1876, driven by a carriage through the persistent drizzle that seemed to cling to the glen like a shroud. His primary concern was the children's welfare, specifically the vague allegations of malnourishment and neglect that had begun to trickle into official channels. His inspection of the facilities revealed clean, if Spartan, conditions, and the children, though uniformly quiet, appeared adequately clothed and fed. Yet, McGregor noted a pervasive atmosphere of profound, unchildlike order. The children, as always, moved with a disconcerting precision, their chores performed in an almost synchronized ballet of silent efficiency. He observed their fixed gazes, their unnerving stillness, and in his private report, a copy of which rests in the National Archives of Scotland, he described them as uncommonly subdued, almost unnaturally so, as if their youthful spirits had been smoothed away. He could not, however, find any concrete evidence of abuse or mistreatment, only an unsettling, intangible anomaly. Following McGregor's visit, and perhaps spurred by his subtle apprehension, the local presbytery in Edinburgh sent a more senior clergyman, Reverend Alistair Cunningham, a man known for his robust faith and his stern belief in the power of spiritual cleansing. Reverend Cunningham spent several days at Black Hollow conducting daily sermons and attempting to engage the children in spirited recitations of Scripture. Like his predecessors, he found their silence unnerving, their responses rote and devoid of genuine enthusiasm. What truly unsettled him, however, occurred on his final night. He had been conducting evening prayers in the common room when he perceived a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the air, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the building. The children, seated before him, suddenly grew utterly rigid, their eyes widening imperceptibly, their faces momentarily contorted by an expression of profound, unearthly peace. He quickly dismissed it as fatigue or an overactive imagination. Yet he felt compelled to conduct an impromptu exorcism ritual throughout the orphanage, sprinkling holy water in every dormitory and chanting prayers in every room. He claimed to feel a chilling resistance in certain areas, particularly near the main dormitory. His report, unlike McGregor's, spoke not of neglect, but of a profound spiritual disquiet, urging for deeper investigation into the unseen forces at play. Dr. Malcolm Guthrie, a medical inspector dispatched by the Regional Health Board, visited a few months later. His focus was on the children's physical well-being. He found them generally healthy, albeit underweight, a common condition in most orphanages. However, his examination revealed a puzzling physiological detail: a small faint discoloration on the skin of many of the children, typically located on the nape of tall, neck or behind the ear. It was a pale, almost silvery mark, almost like a birthmark but uniform in its subtle hue. He documented it meticulously, but could offer no medical explanation. He noted that the children themselves seemed entirely unaware of its presence, or simply unresponsive when questioned about it. This curious mark, combined with the ubiquitous lethargy and vacant gazes, left Dr. Guthrie with a sense of profound medical inadequacy. The children, he concluded, were physically sound, yet profoundly altered. Each investigation, instead of bringing clarity, merely layered more chilling questions onto the enigma of Black Hollow. The authorities saw no crime, the church saw spiritual malaise, and the doctors saw no easily diagnosable ailment. The orphanage, with its silent children and its pervasive, inexplicable atmosphere, continued to defy categorization, a haunting anomaly nestled deep within the unforgiving Scottish landscape, gathering its secrets as silently as the moor gathered its mists. The escalating disquiet at Black Hollow Orphanage reached its chilling zenith on a night forever etched into the terrified memories of those few who witnessed it from a distance. It was the winter of 1877, a night of savage weather that seemed to perfectly mirror the internal turmoil brewing within the desolate glen. A furious gale howled down from the peaks, whipping the moors into a frenzy, driving sheets of freezing rain and sleet against the granite walls of the orphanage. The very air vibrated with the force of the storm, a cacophony of shrieking wind and lashing rain that drowned out all other sound. Yet, despite the elemental fury, the villagers of Guernshiel, huddled by their firesides, reported a new, terrifying sound cutting through the tempest. It was a faint, high-pitched singing, a chorus of ethereal voices that seemed to resonate beneath the roar of the wind, emanating from the direction of Black Hollow. It wasn't a cheerful carol or a soothing lullaby. It was a monotonous, almost primal chant, repetitive and devoid of melody, carrying with it a profound sense of ancient sorrow. Some claimed it was a wail, others a low, continuous hum, but all agreed it was deeply, unnervingly unnatural. Old Man MacLeod, roused from his bed by the unholy chorus, gripped his rosary and muttered about the hungry ground finally claiming its due. As the night wore on, a new phenomenon pierced the inky blackness that enveloped the orphanage. Lights began to flicker in the narrow windows, not the steady, comforting glow of lanterns, but intermittent, pulsing flickers that seemed to dance with an unnatural energy. They were too bright to be candles, too erratic to be oil lamps. They cast long, dancing shadows that writhed across the interior walls, visible even from the distant village through the driving rain. Villagers, peering through rain-streaked panes or braving the storm for a furtive glance, spoke of seeing vague, fleeting shapes moving behind the glass. Small figures, perfectly still for a moment, then gone, replaced by another, equally silent. It was a terrifying, silent ballet, performed against the backdrop of a building that seemed to pulse with an unholy life of its own. Then, just as the storm reached its peak, a blinding flash of light erupted from the topmost window of the orphanage, momentarily illuminating the entire glen in a stark, ethereal white. It was followed not by a crash or a thunderclap, but by an immediate absolute silence. The wind, which had been, in shrieking moments before, seemed to die instantaneously. The lashing rain ceased. An unnatural, suffocating stillness descended upon the glen, a profound quiet that was more terrifying than any storm. Those who witnessed it from Guernshiel described the experience with a unified horror. They spoke of the world holding its breath, of a moment when the very fabric of reality seemed to stretch and then snap. They watched in frozen terror as the light in the orphanage windows faded completely, leaving the building a stark black silhouette against the gray, breaking dawn. No flames erupted, no smoke curled from the chimneys. Just darkness, and then an emptiness. No one dared to approach Black Hollow for 3 days. The fear was too great, the memory of the light and the impossible silence too fresh. When Sheriff Murdoch, accompanied by 2 reluctant constables, finally made the arduous journey, they found the orphanage doors standing ajar, swaying slightly on their rusted hinges in the gentle breeze. The interior was cold, still, and utterly, profoundly empty. The beds were neatly made, The common rooms tidy, but of the children and the staff, there was not a single trace. Not a discarded blanket, not a dropped toy, not a single footprint in the soft earth surrounding the building. Only the silent, lingering scent of damp stone, and an enduring, inexplicable chill that seemed to seep from the very heart of the building. The turning point had come, and with it, the final terrifying silence. The final, inexplicable silence that descended upon Black Hollow Orphanage was a silence that echoed for miles, seeping into the collective consciousness of the Highlands. The official response, when it eventually came, was a grim exercise in bureaucratic damage control. There was no longer a mystery to investigate in the traditional sense. There was only an overwhelming, absolute absence. The authorities, bewildered and unnerved by the lack of any tangible evidence, had no choice but to declare the orphanage officially closed. The heavy oak doors were symbolically locked, and then boarded up, the windows nailed shut with thick planks of wood. It was an act less of securing a building, and more of sealing a wound. Black Hollow Orphanage was left to rot. The harsh Scottish weather, which had carved the surrounding landscape for millennia, now set about reclaiming the structure itself. Lichen crept across the granite, moss greened the roof slates, and weeds pushed their way through the cracks in the flagstone path. Within a few short years, the imposing edifice began its slow, inexorable descent into ruin. The windows, once like unblinking eyes, became genuinely empty, shattered panes allowing the wind and rain to scour the deserted interiors. The once tidy beds became mere frames of decaying wood, the institutional austerity slowly giving way to the wild, untamed chaos of nature. Of the few individuals who had direct ties to the orphanage, silence became their chosen shield. The surviving relatives of the vanished staff, those who had lost Sister Agnes and the few caretakers, spoke of their loss only in hushed, private moments. They never sought answers, perhaps intuitively understanding that the truth, if it existed, lay beyond the realm of human comprehension. Their grief was a quiet, internal thing, tinged with a terror they could never articulate. Finn, the solitary, survivor from the first disappearance, now a young man touched by profound trauma, became an enduring, living testament to Black Hollow's dark legacy. He never spoke of the orphanage to outsiders, his eyes holding a distant, haunted look that spoke volumes. He lived a life of quiet solitude, a perpetual shadow on the edges of Guernshiel, forever listening for the hum that only he had truly experienced. His silence was not born of choice, but of an intimate, terrifying knowledge that severed him from the normal world. Yet, even with its official abandonment and its descent into ruin, Black Hollow Orphanage refused to be forgotten. Reports of strange activity continued to ripple through the local community. Whispers carried on the same winds that sighed through the building's empty shell. Shepherds caught on the moors after nightfall would swear they saw faint, pulsating lights within the ruined walls, a soft, ethereal glow that seemed to breathe with an unseen life. Hikers, venturing too close to the glen, claimed to hear the faint, mournful echo of children singing, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied chorus that faded as quickly as it arose. The very air around the ruins retained its chilling stillness, a palpable quiet that deterred even the most curious or adventurous. Birds would not nest in the eaves, and wild animals seemed to give the area a wide berth. Black Hollow had become a place of profound, undeniable absence, yet simultaneously, a place of an equally profound, unsettling presence. The building, decaying and forlorn, was now more than just an abandoned structure. It was a mausoleum of the unknown, a silent sentinel, guarding a secret that defied all understanding, forever etched into the desolate landscape of the Scottish Highlands. The year is 2025. The ruins of Black Hollow Orphanage stand as a gaunt skeleton of a building, a silent, moss-covered testament to a century and a half of history, and a horrifying unsolved mystery. The wind, still a constant companion, sighs through empty window frames and whistles through the cracks in crumbling granite walls. The place is a fixed point of unease in a world that has otherwise moved on. A place where a profound and unsettling quiet continues to hold sway. In the modern era, the story of the silent orphanage of Black Hollow has been resurrected, not by whispered fears around a hearth, but by the cold, meticulous work of historians, the detached speculation of paranormal researchers, and the curiosity of a new generation. They come armed not with rosaries and holy water, but with ground-penetrating radar, digital recorders, and thermal imaging cameras. They come seeking answers in the ruins, hoping to find a single, tangible clue that might explain the impossible disappearance of 24 children and their caretakers. Historians, poring over digitized census records and church archives, have painstakingly compiled the names of the missing children and the vanished staff. They've discovered the peculiar, recurring patterns in the children's backgrounds that Elias Croft had once identified, but they can offer no rational explanation for it. It remains a statistical anomaly, a chilling coincidence that points to a grand, terrible design, but without any evidence of the architect or the conspirator. They note the official reports of the period, the bewildered observations of the doctor and the priest, and conclude with the same frustrating verdict: unsolvable. Paranormal researchers, their tools tuned to the unseen, have documented strange phenomena around the ruins. They speak of inexplicable fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, of cold spa oats that defy the laws of physics, and of eerie silent presences that seem to register on their most sensitive equipment. They've captured audio recordings that contain no discernible sounds, yet leave the listener with a chilling sense of profound, oppressive quiet. But these are fragments, pieces of a puzzle that do not form a coherent picture. They can prove that something is there, but they cannot tell you what it is or why it remains. The locals, however, a generation removed from the original horror, still harbor the old fears. They tell stories not of ghosts, but of the hollows, a term they use for the children who vanished. They tell of the silent ones, who still watch from the empty windows of the ruins, a chilling tradition passed down from parent to child. The stories are told not to frighten, but to warn, to stay away from the glen, to respect the quiet, and to understand that some mysteries are not meant to be disturbed. The story of the silent orphanage of Black Hollow is a haunting reflection on the nature of history itself. It is a story that proves some truths are not written in ledgers or carved into stone, but are instead etched into the very atmosphere of a place. It is a mystery that has lingered, not because of a lack of evidence, but because the evidence itself is the silence. The chilling, profound, and unending silence. So what happened on that night in 1877? Did a community simply go mad and conspire to erase an orphanage? Did ancient folklore reach its grasping hand into the world of men and claim its own? Or were the children of Black Hollow taken by a force so profound, so silent, that it could not be understood, only felt? The answer, as it has for over a century, hangs on the wind, a chilling whisper from a place that has nothing left to say.